Hi, and welcome back. This is Amy Greeter. I'm a Senior Vice President with Coker Group, and I'm joined today by Taylor Cowart, a manager also of the firm. We are delighted to be back with you today to continue our discussion about the strategic planning process. So, we are here to start focusing on the details of step number two today. If you haven't seen the first step, go ahead and feel free to watch that one first and come on back. And I'll also give you a brief overview of the process right now before we delve too far into things. So, Coker's strategy is really to look at five concrete steps to finish a strategic planning process. And those steps are number one, understand what your starting point is. Number two, our topic for today, focus on your endpoint. Number three, make sure that you have your course lined out. Number four, make sure that you set milestones along the way. And number five, make sure that you've got the right resources, equipment, people, time, all the things that you need to complete the process successfully. So, with that overview, let's jump into our second stage in the strategic planning process. And that's really understanding what your endpoint is going to be. I've often heard a saying that if you don't know what you're running to, you're never going to reach it. And that's the concept that belies where we are today. So, as we think about where do you start, how do you define what your endpoint is going to be? I think it's important that we start with an example. So, as exemplified by my mock turtleneck today, I am a big Steve Jobs fan. And for those of you that don't know, Steve Jobs was one of the co founders of Apple, and he was a multiple time CEO of the organization. He was there, he was gone. After a decade, he came back to Apple and really started to turn around what was going on at Apple. So when Steve came back after, 10 years from watching it from a distance, he had a very focused intent for what he wanted the company to be. When he came back, it was interesting to note that in his first foray at things, he sent 70% of projects down the river. There were 70% of things that he thought didn't fit with what he saw as the future for Apple. Things that he wasn't willing to commit more resources to or put more time and energy into that would divert him from what was otherwise his very sole focus. He decided that he wanted to really revolutionize the industry. He came up with the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, all the other I's that we probably have in our pockets and on our desks here with us today. But he did so in a way that really was deliberate in what he wanted the organization to be. That, I think, that sort of vision, that focus on where we want to be, is the same sort of concept that we preach to our clients, whether they're health systems, critical access hospitals, medical practices, pharma, whoever it is that we can reach. We help them figure out, what does that need to be? What are they really running towards, so that they can figure that out? How do they get back there? I think one of the interesting points that we've talked about before is, what do you want to be when you grow up? You ask it to kids all along, and the same thing for institutions, organizations. What do you want to be when you grow up? What are you running towards in the next year, and 5 years, and 10 years? And helping really explicitly craft that vision of what you want to be, where you want to go, what you want your company to be truly focused on, is a critical part in the overall process. Now, I think that there is another example that bears some consideration. Taylor, why don't you tell us a little bit about Casper and how else we can benefit this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Amy was saying, this becomes the where are we going, and kind of as we look at how we're going to develop that vision. I think Casper is a really great example of utilizing your people to really create that vision and utilizing their different, skill sets, et cetera, to figure out what is this company going to be. And so in 2013, five friends were basically sitting around in their Manhattan, co-working space, discussing opportunities. Some of them had experiences with startups and had tried to really dig into this world and had some success, but not a ton of success. And so they were kind of sitting around talking about ideas. And really wanted to, I think this is so interesting, said we want a market disruptor, and we want to really come up with a product that's going to disrupt the market, looking at, how Uber did with taxis, et cetera. And one of the friends had actually, in his previous days, had sold dorm bedding out of his dorm. And so he said, I think I know a lot about mattresses. Let's go with that. And actually, as they started talking about it, I mean, you talk about five friends that are living in Manhattan. I think anyone that's lived in a big city can understand the really big difficulty of trying to drag a mattress up to a fifth floor walk up. And so they said, how can we do this? How can we make this better? And so they all started talking, and you had the first friend who was a mattress expert, a friend that had really just incredible design ideas and had web design experience, one that was really good at the styling portion of it, and one that had extreme brand awareness and experience in developing a significant brand. So they really just had these skill sets that each of them kind of could bring to the table, and they all formed it. And so, what we saw was Casper is wildly successful and has spawned a ton of these mattress in a box companies, right? I mean, I have a mattress in a box that, that I sleep on now. And so it has become such a complete disruptor in the marketplace as far as how we buy mattresses, how they get delivered, et cetera. And what they sought out to do was really achievable based on utilizing what they all brought to the table and saying, how can we make all of our skill sets work in a really, really new and innovative way? And so what we look at here is this example, this great example of utilizing the people that you have around you to build that vision. And I think that that is something that sometimes we're remiss on in organizations. When we look at strategic planning, a lot of times it gets brought up to the executive level, and it kind of, stops there. And they don't often bring it down to our employee level and say, what are we seeing on the front lines? And we talked a little bit about this in the first session of, making sure you get that stakeholder feedback and making sure it comes from different places. But as you start to actually build that vision, I think it's important to not leave it there, but to include them in that process. And so, a lot of times what we'll do when we work with organizations is set up kind of working groups. And these can be, based on lots of different factors, depending on your different organization. It could be a single working group if you're a smaller practice, but you really want to make sure that you've got a representative group in those discussions. So whether you break it down by location or by specialty or by one of these other factors that drives an organization, or just skill sets. If you have providers and then you have your customer service experience employees, those type things, breaking it down into working groups and really making sure you're getting that feedback as you're building that vision, so that you're not just leaving it at what's broken, which was one, but where are we going, which is two. And there's so much good information you can get from the ground. And so, again, we want to make sure that we have representation of all of our stakeholders and also all of our consumers. So you want to make sure you've got age difference, minority, gender, tenure, all of those things representative in your working groups to really make sure you're getting the best information and building the best vision for not only today, but the future. You want to make sure that you're really working in a way that keeps people engaged and passionate, that you're driving this forward. I think a lot of times too, what we see is these get started and they're great in theory, but people get tired of going to another meeting and they don't want to come up. And so, getting those meetings scheduled, getting it into a pattern and making people excited to come is really important. And you just want to make sure that we are setting realistic expectations. I think, the flip side of that is sometimes if there is no leadership in the room, we can have a bunch of employees sitting around and talking, and the realities of maybe some of the financial components or some of the resource components aren't necessarily there when we're building our vision. So while absolutely have these working groups, also have a kind of a senior vice president or someone in that C-suite that can say, this is the reality of where we are and what we can actually realistically achieve based on what we have at the table. And then, the other big thing on all of this is, and we talk about this so much when we talk about anything we're doing with physicians, especially, but with any organization we're working with, is you have to build buy-in, right? And I think that healthcare is one of the really interesting ones where we see this disconnect because we've got C-suite and a lot of times, and we're seeing more physicians in C-suite positions these days. But for a long time, it was non-physician CEOs and physicians. And there was this disconnect between what the CEO was saying and then the buy-in from the physicians who are actually the ones that are going to be going out and likely achieving a lot of that strategic plan. And so you want to make sure that from the get-go, you have those champions on your front lines that are saying, yeah, I was a part of this vision. I can see why we're going there. I get the discussion and I'm going to push everyone with me. And so I just, we think it's so important to involve people at every step of this process and not keep it at just these high level discussions. Making sure it filters down is the real way that you're going to impact change.
I could not agree more, Taylor. And I think once you've gotten the right people in the room to help you cast the vision, I think the next step is making sure that that is documented and shared. I think often about sports teams and how when you drop a play, right, you put the X's and O's on a board somewhere where everybody can visually see it. And everybody not only can buy into that, but they understand what it looks like. And so the business analogy that would carry there is making sure that you've got a strategic plan that is documented and is accessible, that people can review and revisit and talk about. I think one of the businesses that we have seen do this so effectively is GE under Jack Welch's, guidance as CEO in the 80s. Jack did a great job coming up with the three circles concept, defining what is really important to the business and where does it fall. So if it didn't fall in services, technology, or core, Jack said, that's not part of our business. I want you to think about it in this framework, run everything that you do through this framework, understand it. And when they went through that process, they found things that fell out. Housewares division ended up being not within one of those three categories once they documented it and thought about it and got feedback on it and started to, roll it out to get buy-in. Wasn't where they were going. And so that had to be put aside. And so I think as you have people that are weighing into the process and as you document it, as you start to share it, you may find that there are opportunities within your business that you shouldn't pursue. Maybe 70% of the products that Apple threw away were things that weren't core to them. And you may find that there are some that, like housewares, just aren't going to be where you need to be. And so getting that documented, getting feedback on it, really refining that is another critical step in the process, in my mind. Taylor, you want to talk about how we summarize this and how do we really roll it out to the masses?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aimee said, we document it. And a lot of times, you'll see that in your pillars of priority or something like that. And then we take that and that's more specific to a strategic plan, right? We don't necessarily go around talking about our pillars of priority all the time. Though I know even in Coker Group, we actually do. We have pillars of priority and they are very much a discussion in every meeting we have. But sometimes that's hard to communicate to the masses. And a lot of times it's not something necessarily that our consumers are going to understand, right? So you want to create something that really speaks to how do we make it easy for people to understand where we're going? And the mission and vision statement is obviously that easy way. And I think sometimes this gets lost in our strategic planning process. But when you're doing a full enterprise strategic planning process, and even if you're doing it for a subset, you can have a mission statement for a specialty or a service line or something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be called a mission statement, but it can be, this summary of where are we going? How do we espouse this on a daily basis, and how do all of our employees fall into this? And so you want to make sure that you review your mission and vision. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that you have to change it every time you do your strategic plan, but make sure that it still matches with where you're going. Does your mission and vision statement support those strategies? And in turn, do your strategies support that mission statement? Or when you go back to your mission statement, do you say, no, that's actually, I stand by that mission statement. That's what we want. We now need to make sure our strategies are driving that mission statement. And so you want to make sure there's alignment between those two. And sometimes it's as simple as looking at that mission statement. It makes us, remind ourselves, where did we start from? Where did we want to go from the beginning? It's okay if that's changed, but let's change it. And I think a great example of this is Facebook. And we all know what happened in 2016, right? It was all over the news. There was this theory of election, implications, right, that was happening from Facebook. And so Facebook really got thrown into the media of how are you responsibly driving traffic and ensuring that consumers are educated on what they're reading. And if you've been on Facebook recently, there has been a huge push to highlight, fake information that's being spread, and there's fact checking and things like that. And this all comes from this change that happened in about 2017. So Mark Zuckerberg previously, when asked about what the mission of Facebook was, he would say, it's making the world more open and connected. Well, when they stood back and looked at that years later, they realized that's not enough. That is important, but now we have a social responsibility that is a little bit larger than that. And so what they changed it to in 2017 was give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. Right? So it's similar. It's very similar, but that building of community, that those kind of positive spin on that mission statement really changed the way that they do a lot of things internally. And it was really important to them that, again, that was communicated to employees, that it became the foundation of decision making, but also that it was communicated to their participants, to the people that are using Facebook, that this is our mission. And we want you as consumers to support that. And if you're not, we're going to work to drive that in a productive way. And so all of this is just really, really interesting when you look at what happens in the business world, but also how we can apply this to healthcare. And I think sometimes healthcare feels so different. And we sometimes say, in a lot of ways, it is a completely different beast than a lot of organizations. But when it comes to strategic planning, a lot of these same concepts apply, and making sure that everything is in line and really cohesive and makes sense not only from an internal perspective, but an external perspective. If you were to take it outside and explain your plan to somebody, we want to make sure all of that is in place, just like any other business.
Absolutely. Great points, Taylor. So what we've done today is we've been focusing on the endpoint is we've talked about building a strategic plan, documenting it, and summarizing it. So as a concluding point today, I want to make sure that we all understand how important it is to really have a plan that's responsive to the needs of the environment. Much like Facebook's mission changed, as Taylor said, in recent years, I think it's okay for your plan to be responsive to what's happening in your environment. And that might be regional, it might be local, it might be hyper local, depending upon what your landscape looks like, what your external environment looks like, what your internal environment looks like. I think another great example of this sense of adaptability and making sure that the endpoint is now really where you need to be running towards is the example of PepsiCo. So much like Taylor said about having a strategy that has worked, but maybe isn't optimal in today's environment, I think PepsiCo went through some of those sort of growing pains, and it did it under the leadership of Indra Nooyi. So Indra Nooyi had come on as the CEO of PepsiCo in 2006. She actually stayed in that role for 12 years, which is about 7 years longer than any other, major Fortune 500 company. And her success during that time was the result of her having to make a difficult decision, which was, I'm getting closer to retirement. Do I want to really optimize revenue in the short run and then retire? Or do I want to work with the company to make some difficult choices in my last couple of years and really set the company up in a strategic direction that it is going to be most optimal for its long-term success as opposed to my long-term success? And what Indra did is she created a campaign called Performance with a Purpose. And really, she categorized PepsiCo's products into three elements: what's fun for you, what's good for you, and what's better for you. And within those things, within those categories, she really looked at how do we move away from, chips and regular sodas to other products that are better for you as a person. Part of that was also how do we operate in a manner that's better for the environment? How do we look at sustainability, and redesigning our packaging and enhance recycling efforts, etc. And so Indra made the choice to go that what I would call the hard path, not the easy path, but to look at really transforming the organization so that it could be viable into the long term. And that was successful. That performance with a purpose ended up being a driving force for Pepsi's sort of strategic redirection, repositioning, ongoing success. And I think what's interesting about that is that Indra credits a lot of the ideas for that whole strategic redirection out of some town hall meetings that she had when she first became a CEO, in which employees talked about really wanting to do something that was better for people's bodies, better for the environment, etc. And so Indra took that feedback and she really changed the course of where the organization was going and really switched that endpoint from being just a Pepsi company, a regular pop kind of company, to being more of a lifestyle company, a respected brand in terms of wellness, etc. And that's not an easy transition to make, but neither are the decisions that many of us are making right now about our healthcare organizations, right? We are having to make choices, particularly in the outgoing phases of the COVID-19 pandemic, in what we're going to be for the future. And it may not necessarily be the same sort of inpatient focus, fee for service, high volume type of environment in which we have existed previously. That may not be what's appropriate or what's necessary or what's best for us going forward. And so coming to terms with the fact that whatever your endpoint is going to be, it needs to be something that's adaptable to current market conditions, responsive to the current day needs, is really important. So Taylor, why don't you say a couple words and bring us home, and then we'll talk about where we're going to go for our third step in this process.
No, I think that was great, Aimee. And I think Indra is such a great example of how, not only did she have a vision, but she really utilized those people within her organization to support that. And I think, to Aimee's point at the end there, making sure that endpoint is adaptable. I mean, we talked about this so much in the first one, but it's hard not to talk about it, right? In this year, which is, we all are at a different endpoint right now than we were at the start of 2020. And we have moved that endpoint. And the definition of a successful organization going forward is going to be, how were you able to update that and make your strategic plan work in a different time? And I just think that's so important this year of all years, as we look to either update our strategic plan to fit the changes that happened in 2020, or if we are starting a new strategic plan, and understanding, really where we need to be going, which is likely a little bit different than where we thought we were going at the beginning of 2020.
Absolutely. Well, Taylor and I really appreciate you joining us today for this second session. Again, if you haven't watched the first one, it's not too late to go ahead and check that one out. And then we'll look forward to you joining us for steps 3, 4, and 5 in the coming weeks. Again, thank you. Please make sure that you reach out to us via LinkedIn or our emails, get a hold of us through the COCR website, follow us on social media platforms, and we'll look forward to engaging with you in a discussion about really where you see your endpoint turning to be in the near future. Thanks again for joining us and have a great day. Bye now.